Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is an extract from my first book, The Green Queen from Java. It's a novel, it's a tale, a yarn intended to entertain you. Yes, it does reflect my experience of falling in love with Indonesia, my experience of falling in love with an Indonesian lady, and my increasing awareness of the paranormal and black magic, or some might like to say my descent into madness. But it is just a novel. Any resemblance to real people is completely unintentional. Yes, it's based on my experience, so yes, it's based on people I've met and know, but amalgams or caricatures of them. I do mention real people and real life celebrities and hope that they, along with anybody who believes they've identified themselves, will forgive me. Maddie was constantly praying to Allah and repeating the various prayers her nene had taught her all those years ago. In particular, Maddie prayed to Sunan Kalijaga, the source of Indonesian Sufism and Kejawen. He is credited with merging gamelan and wayang kulit with Islam, making its spread more acceptable. He also introduced Masyarak, a social structure of equals as opposed to the caste system of the Hindus. To this day, Kejawen is associated with the banned Communist Party, and it's certainly its followers look more towards Sukarno's humanitarian policy, in contrast to the crony capitalism of Suharto, who suppressed the Gnostic elements of its teaching. Sunan Kalijaga, along with Nyi Roro Kidul, is believed to have assisted Pranambaram Senopati in establishing the Mataram Sultanate. One day I saw Maddie facing east to pray and asked her what she was doing. She told me she wasn't sure, but it was something Kaneni had taught her, and it worked. In fact, no sooner had she prayed to Nyi Roro Kidul and she was being sick in the waste paper basket. Her pains then gone, but always returned. Maddie had brought various Islamic jimat from Demak, the site of Sunan Kalijaga's grave, which he now wore for protection. When Muni came to the door and spotted Maddie's new jewellery, he seemed shocked, not least as Maddie had always dismissed his superstitions as nonsense. Maddie praying to the east troubled me somewhat, as I wasn't sure if Nyi Roro Kidul was a benevolent force, and decided that I would ask Allah when I prayed at Jumatan. That Friday at the Muhammadiyah Masjid, I asked Allah why he hadn't been more active, and if it was acceptable for Maddie to pray to Sunan Kalijaga and Nyi Roro Kidul. Perhaps predictably there was no response. After all, Allah cannot be heard. At Jumatan, I was wondering if I had a verruca, called mata ikan or fish eye in Indonesia, and something I repeatedly felt despite there being limited visual evidence. And inspecting my feet as Pa Ustad spoke in slightly arcane Bahasa that I understood little of. Suddenly, as I was inspecting my feet, Allah, or more probably his messenger, answered me that Maddie, Buddy and I should pray, should submit and put our faith in him. However, if it helped Maddie, it was permissible to pray to him via circuitous methods, which are central to Kejawen belief. But of all, he said, Islam is simple. You proclaim your faith, pray 5 times a day, provide zakat, fast during Ramadan, and perform Hajj. Why complicate things? Maddie was getting increasingly desperate. She had imagined that a dukun could work like Western medicine, ridding you of your ailments, if not immediately, within a few days. Increasingly, the province of Banten was being mentioned in relation to our problems. I knew that the Badui lived in Banten, and if anyone could solve our problems, it was the Badui. After all, they had been President Suharto's ultimate mystical mentors. The Badui are highly secretive, living in isolated mountain kampungs on the borders of Banten and Java Barat. Only 40 families of Badui Dalam who wear white might help, but they could be accessed via the Badui Luar, some of whom were surplus Badui Dalam. Badui Luar wear blue and interact a little with the local Sunda people. The Badui Dalam grow all of their own food and make their own tools and clothes. They reject any introduction of artifacts from outside. It is believed that the Badui originated from Tamil Nadu, but nobody is really sure. I feel it's more likely that they simply have high levels of Melanesian genes from the island's original inhabitants, not discounting that these genes may have come via southern India. I also wanted to go trekking with the Badui. When I suggested it to Widiati and her boyfriend, they looked horrified, whilst mentioning it to Maddie would be an admission of severe mental illness. The Badui Dalam never leave their inner kampungs, leading them to being named the Invisible People. But some Badui Luar males have moved, including a small number in Chiputat. Apparently, they are banished from their homelands if they committed adultery, so the colony in Chiputat must be that of adulterers. Paanga Baya had made contact with them and bought some blue kine from them. He gave me one, which I made into a sarong. I wore the auspicious garment for our Salamatan, but nobody recognised its significance, not even my Dukan brother-in-law, and not even after I'd pointed it out to him. So when Maddie had said that Omsa Sulio suggested visiting Banten, I was both delighted maybe we would meet the Badui, and concerned after what Allah had told me, maybe we would meet the Badui. Sulio came round the next Saturday afternoon, but when he pointed the cards towards Tangerang Banten, I knew we weren't going to the Badui. We travelled past the new IKEA, where Widiati had just bought a bed called Omzig. Actually, it was called Brimes, but somehow that's nothing like as humorous to me, and spent all her night with her boyfriend putting it together. She paid more than a real bed, as her mother put it, and given that IKEA furniture is made around Jogja and Solo, she certainly has a point which would be completely lost on Jakarta's aspirational middle class. I told you Maddie was clever. After IKEA we kept travelling and eventually pulled off the toll road in somewhere that looked remarkably like Tangerang Selatan, but clearly wasn't, or should I now call it Tangerang Selatan Banten. Years after writing this, radioactive materials were discovered at a squash court in Tangerang Banten. Apparently, a worker at Indonesia's nuclear energy had developed a sideline in remediating areas he had purposely contaminated. We travelled along scruffy roads of workers' houses and even scruffier factories until we reached a masjid, where we turned and travelled along a maze of roads before ending up at some quasi-Islamic building. The sound of shawlat was being pumped through the building, but it looked more like a doctor's surgery. A smiling woman greeted us and explained that Pa Ustad would see us shortly, but we were to wait. Maddie was petrified, believing that a ruqya, Islamic exorcism, would be performed. The smiling lady reassured her that it was simply a consultation with Pa Ustad, followed by therapy if Maddie wanted it, and that Pa Ustad may recommend some natural herbal medication. I was happy the lady in Banten was so reassuring, and after following the Kejawan path in Java, we now seem to be following something much closer to what Allah wanted. What was going on here was a community health service, an alternative to doctors who were expensive and probably in short supply in this populous area lacking in amenities. We waited for ages. Pa Ustad seemed to want to see his regular patients prior to seeing Maddie. Even when he finished, we waited again while he performed his shaulat. I was somewhat surprised to find out that Pa Ustad was young, though not handsome, and dressed in batik rather than the more traditional Islamic clothing. I later found out that the family had been neighbours of Cecilio. Pa Ustad began to talk, then asked some questions. He looked at the palm of his hands, in the way a doctor in the UK would reach for MIMS, and spoke again. He was speaking in Bahasa, and suggested that the physical effects Maddie was feeling were due to a hormonal imbalance. He did not blame black magic for this, but it was implied. This made perfect sense to me. Although Maddie would never admit it, she could not be many years from the menopause, and if black magic did exist, then surely it worked through minor chemical changes on the body. What could be more subtle than hormones? Although I now believe that the way in which black magic affects the body is on the blood supply, particularly microcirculation, its effects on the internal organs. In English I expressed my approval, but wanted to know why Buddy was experiencing the same symptoms as she'd had her womb removed. Pa Ustad looked shocked that I'd been following the conversation and asked Maddie if I could understand Bahasa, to which she said yes if he spoke slowly, but my spoken Bahasa was not good enough for a return conversation. To my surprise, Pa Ustad started to quicken his speech, and I had to give up on trying to follow the conversation. The next thing I understood was that Pa Ustad had brought out a large jar of pickled ginseng, the sort so often on display in Chinese herbalists. Once again, all was making sense. I knew that if ginseng did work, it was probably on the hormones. If Maddie could use ginseng to relieve the symptoms, we could go on to fight the magic. However, there were still two doubts in my mind. Firstly, Budde's symptoms, and secondly, he kept mentioning Korean ginseng, when I was sure that North American ginseng was required. I don't exactly know why I knew about North American ginseng, but a few years earlier I'd researched Canadian ginseng for Nagian. The conversation with Pa Ustad moved to buying ginseng, and I explained that we could regularly do that. After all, we were in Jakarta, not an industrial estate in Banten, but he kept mentioning Korean ginseng, and every instinct told me this was wrong. Slowly, Pa Ustad persuaded us to part with $250 for numerous preparations of this ginseng, on top of the consultation that was anonymous, up to us, but we'd placed $50 in an envelope. I knew that ginseng was expensive, so despite my doubts about its origins, all seemed legitimate. Maddie had also put her trust in Allah and to pray, which I knew was sound advice. We were even happier when Maddie was eventually presented with mountains of capsules and told to take an incredible number each day. He asked us to return in 10 days, when in all probability she could go down to a lower and less expensive dose. We then moved into the therapy room, where the kindly lady placed her hands on Maddie's head. It involved some liquids and oils, so much that when the therapy was over, Maddie's always perfect hair looked less so. However, during this therapy, Maddie had commented on how she now felt her head get very hot as the lady moved her hands. She had been relieved. She repeated the process over Maddie's body, spending a long time on her stomach, saying something about Maddie having pent-up energy there. Had she removed the spirit, as I think was suggested, well, maybe. I knew it would return, but with the help of the ginseng, it was possible that we'd found a solution. The drive home was even longer. partly because it was now Saturday night, and partly because Cecilio kept getting lost. I was beginning to realise that I know the roads of Jakarta better than I wished I'd known this earlier, as many years ago he'd gone the wrong way to Sepong, but I'd said nothing, thinking he probably knew better routes than me, which he obviously didn't. There was plenty of time to ask Maddie what had been said when Pa Ustad accelerated his speech. He'd told Maddie that she had too many hormones, and this meant that she was unsatisfied in lovemaking. Her normally healthy and active hormones were rampant, turning her into a nymphomaniac. I realised that any male would be somewhat hurt by this, and given that Maddie had taken to sleeping on the floor, where she believed it would be more difficult for spirits to enter us, so our normally at least daily lovemaking had waned somewhat. I wished I'd followed the conversation, as I would have asked if Maddie should have 8 or 10 orgasms a day. Of course, I actually wouldn't, as I'm rarely so quick-witted. Ustad had also said that Maddie had not brought the ghost with her, or he might have spoken with it. This was because the ghost wasn't Pribumi. Of course, he may have discovered, as I had, that the ghost was Chinese, but somehow I think it was all leading up to the ghost being British. Pa Ustad was just like the Indonesian men who approached Maddie for casual sex, refusing to believe that she actually prefers bullets. Of course, Maddie has very limited experience with Indonesian males, or that such a woman, exuding sensuality, was faithful to her husband. You see, Maddie is somewhat jealous and possessive, the upside being that she's faithful and protective towards me. Her jealousy is partly fueled by her neighbours, including Bar Annie, who spotted Maddie putting lipstick-stained tissues on my pillow at a party we held one New Year's Eve. Like most women who exude sensuality, Maddie is completely unaware of hers and certainly not putting it on. In fact, this is probably what makes women like Maddie so alluring. One boyfriend told her that when she wears skirts, they're either too short or too long, but that's how Maddie likes them. This isn't a strategy to look bleep, it's simply her choice, which she is very protective of, a somewhat radical stance in a Muslim country. Not that Maddie would ever see it in political terms. Indeed, Maddie has always seen Julia Perez as an inspiration, more so than politicians. Perez had apologised to the Indonesian Ulama Council, MUI, for being born too bleep when ridiculously accused of pornography. Julia Perez died of cervical cancer whilst I was writing my story, and Maddie sat on our bed and cried. Maddie crying came as no surprise, but when her reclusive younger sister called to say that she was also crying, I realised that to Maddie, Julia Perez was a modern-day Cartini. Indeed, it reminded me of my surprise when so many of my feminist friends in the UK grieved the passing of Princess Diana. Years later, I found that the kindly lady had come to the clinic with a similar problem, and after unsuccessful treatment had moved into the clinic. Slowly, with the Pa Ustad's assistance, the lady had learnt to successfully orgasm. So it would seem that I'd paid $300 to a man who had designs on making my wife his bleep slave. My 8 or 10 orgasms quip to Pa Ustad would have been particularly useful, as if Maddie's Indonesian male pursuers actually knew what she was like in bed, they would be scared off immediately, leaving her to bullets and the devil, Iblis, their macho personas irreparably hurt until the next pretty girl walks by. He was only a Pa Ustad. Nevertheless, I was a little shocked and somewhat disturbed. Also disturbing is the story Maddie tells of being asked to attend a meeting at the Inspectorate of Religious Affairs, where her understanding of Islam was questioned, despite the Inspectorate's function being to audit the ministry. Maddie was asked to return for further instruction, but was clearly grossly affronted by the challenge, not least as it seemed like a challenge to her faith, which, like me, she believes only Allah has the right to pass judgment on. Indeed, this is fundamental to our understanding of Islam, but also that she knew it was leading to a demand for bleep favours or money, and most probably both. Maddie had also endured a year of abuse by a rich Batak living in Bintaro, exploiting his economic power over Maddie. Nothing too unusual in Indonesia, except that he was a married Lutheran pastor. Maddie sometimes say that she has learnt as much about Allah after talking to preman and rent boys as she has from Pa Ajis or Pa Ustads. These experiences would seem to reinforce her views. Ultimately, such views can lead to radicalism, but that completely misses the point of Maddie's and my beliefs, as it's not based on a desire to supplant power, simply to question its abuse. In 2000, at the London Middlesex Guildhall Crown Court, the Reverend Anthony Clayton was jailed for 6 months for performing a bleep act on a 13-year-old bell ringer in his Lockington vicarage. Why am I disturbed by this? Because I knew the Reverend Tony Clayton, not well, but since such things are always more shocking the closer one is to them. He's no longer alive to further defend himself, but presumably he was provided with sufficient opportunity at the Guildhall. You see, a Reverend Tony Clayton was a regular at Wigan Casino and ran his own events and DJ'd at them when Wigan closed. His events included the Nottingham Oddfellows All-Nighters in Leicester, where he became a canon at the cathedral, and I attended some of his all-nighters. As an altar boy, maybe a little older than 13, I too had a minor experience with a parish priest. I think I was unscarred, but it probably chipped away at my faith and certainly my morals. I had served altar at the church where Charles Darwin had been baptised, despite him being a Unitarian, and would later take my parents for dinner in his childhood home. When I could no longer keep my thoughts in, it all came out. Hang on a minute, you've the healthiest hormones I've ever come across. Korean ginseng will do the opposite to what Pa Ustad has claimed. There's something very wrong. Nevertheless, Maddie felt relieved from the therapy. So who was I with my Western logic to question what had happened? Maddie was as bad as ever by Monday. She'd been digging into the mountain of pills, but little difference seemed to have occurred. Although I realised that ginseng would not work quickly, I wanted Maddie to visit Pa Angbaya. After all, whilst we had not yet spent a fortune, my money was being spent at twice the normal rate. There were also a number of other problems eating into what money I had in Indonesia that I will share with you later. Pa Angbaya was quiet, as he always is, whilst Maddie told him about the Duke and Pa Ustad we had met. When Maddie explained about the bugs that Umba had extracted from her body, he looked towards me, and there was a knowing exchange of smiles. His normal composure became much more agitated when Maddie mentioned the ginseng. Indeed, he was animated, as though it was he who had paid $300 and not us. It wasn't long before he was splitting open the capsules. He dipped a wet finger in each preparation and tasted them one by one. And at the end, he simply looked at me and said, "Not ginseng, mister." Maddie had been sold similar ingredients to what I buy in my daily jamu, which cost me 20 cents. If there was any ginseng, it was a minute quantity. He said that the ingredients wouldn't harm Maddie, and maybe that she should keep taking them, but I think she was so upset she stopped. Pa Angbaya also named the substance that had made Maddie's head very hot and the oil that had neutralised it. So the whole practice was a sophisticated scam. I felt cheated, but more concerned at the poor people in Banten being sold expensive jamu for their every medical condition, although obviously not as much as we had paid. But it especially focuses on the bleak frustration of married women who I have indicated may well not be getting any interest from their husbands. In cities like Jakarta, there are plenty of opportunities, both commercial and informal, for ladies to relieve their frustration, but this would not have been available in smaller towns and rural areas. But here in Banten, Pak Ustad was well on his way to establishing his own cult. After a long talk with Maddie, we resolved to end our magical mystery tour and put our faith in Allah. With a Javanese girl, you can never tell if they actually agree with you or are simply saying yes. A point lost on Bertrand all those years ago. Nevertheless, we seem to have a meeting of the minds. Well, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. By all means, feel free to comment on it, including criticism, as that's the only way I can improve. Now, I really do hate it when channels keep badgering you to subscribe for them, but I suppose it does tell you when I'm going to post new chapters. I'm aiming to do this every week to 10 days, so it might be a good idea to subscribe if you want to. But thank you again for listening.